Earlier in January, the mayor of the second largest city in Japan made news for something the media had called unprecedented. Takeharu Yamanaka, the mayor of Yokohama, was accused of power harassment, or workplace bullying. The accusation itself wasn't all too uncommon, but this didn't happen in the normal way. No, he was called out in a press conference by his own HR director of all people, in a public call-out being made for the sole reason of exposing just how toxic this guy was. Now, this is unheard of pretty much anywhere, but especially in Japan. And the accusations were wild too. According to the HR director, Yamanaka didn't just treat his subordinates like dirt, he made sure they knew it too. He called them human scum, useless idiots, and low spec. Which, if you're wondering if that last one is as dehumanizing in Japanese as it sounds in English, the answer is yes, without a doubt. This guy was an absolute menace. He was out there comparing employees to animals, slamming desks and physically intimidating his staff, and sending work messages late at night and on holidays, which, admittedly, that last part seems pretty tame by comparison, but it is in the report. But it gets even crazier from there. In June 2023, when the HR director, the guy who was holding the conference in the first place, was working to bring an international conference to Yokohama, the mayor Yamanaka allegedly told him, "If you fail to secure TCAD for Yokohama, then you should prepare to leave this world." So, what's TCAD, you're probably wondering? What might be so important to make such a grave threat to your employee? Now, that would be the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. I'm not even sure you're allowed to have that in Yokohama. To absolutely nobody's surprise, Mayor Yamanaka initially denied everything. Then he admitted to some of it, and then he apologized for more of it. This is all pretty standard stuff in the world of apologies. But I realized that people were reacting with disgust, but not surprise exactly. Nobody was asking the biggest question that was on my mind, which was, dude, what the hell is your problem? I mean, this man has a PhD. He used to be a professor at Yokohama City University. He's on international climate councils. This is an educated, supposedly cosmopolitan leader of Japan's second largest city. So why couldn't he just be normal? Now, I didn't have time to dwell on this too much before seeing the second major news story of the week. 3 major videos had dropped on Japanese social media, each showcasing shocking instances of bullying. Technically, they had each leaked separately earlier, but in early January they had combined to hit some critical mass and hit the front page of everyone's newsfeed at the same time. The video content was truly far beyond what anybody was expecting. Now, the Japanese government has gone through some great lengths to ensure these videos are censored from the internet, so you won't see them here. But I can describe them for you. The first video was in Tochigi Prefecture, filmed on December 19th. Now, this was a 9-second video showing a male high school student in a bathroom punching and kicking a classmate. The classmate was not fighting back. Around them, other students were cheering like they were announcing the start of a UFC match. Someone raises a broom and shouts out like a ringside announcer for a martial arts bout. The video gets over 100 million views. For reference, Japan's population is 124 million. So in response, Tochigi Prefecture Governor Tomiichi Fukuda says he's at a loss for words and demands that the Education Board respond more robustly. Great work, Governor. The second took place on January 8th in Oita Prefecture. While most people were settling back into school or work after the long New Year's holiday, a minute-long video surfaces showing the worst side of humanity. This video shows a student in sports clothes attacking a classmate, jumping on him, punching him, kicking his head. And that's not even the chilling part of this story. 3 days later, the Board of Education receives an email. This email threatened vigilante justice against the staff and students who allowed the bullying to take place. Police increase their presence, but the threat never materializes. The sender is never identified. Great work, police. And the third and potentially most outrageous video, Osaka. Technically filmed in November, but this blew up on January 20th, just 4 days after the press conference calling out the mayor. This video circulates showing an older middle school student grabbing a younger child in a combat hold before throwing the child into the sea. The Board of Education designates it as a serious bullying case. Great job, Board of Education. 3 prefectures, 3 viral videos, all of them hitting the public consciousness right at the same time as one of the most powerful leaders in Japan gets in trouble for bullying. The media outlets don't call it out specifically, but the feeling is everywhere. The internet is abuzz with the idea that maybe Japan does in fact have a bullying problem. And you're a reasonable viewer. I can tell by your taste in YouTubers. Bullying happens everywhere, you might be thinking, and you're right, it does. But there's something specific happening in Japan that demands a closer look because the numbers are getting worse, not better. In the academic year 2024, Japanese schools reported over 770,000 cases of bullying, the highest number ever. This was a 5% jump up from the previous year. Meanwhile, the leading cause of deaths for peoples aged 6 to 19 isn't a road collision, nor is it disease-related. No, the leading cause of death is what should be the most preventable. You know, the one I can't say. And for all of the reasons I've listed, I'd like to take some time tonight to ask a question that might sound provocative on the surface. Is bullying actually getting worse in Japan? And if so, why? What is it about this society that allows and, I'd argue, actively facilitates this level of cruelty not just among adults, but among children as well? And on top of that, how is it related? Does the power harassment of the mayor really have anything to do with the plague of childhood bullying that's currently sweeping the country? Well, to answer that question, I want to take a measured look and do a deep dive into the topic to figure it out. So I'd like to start at the basics because there's a couple topics that are really big that can help everybody digest this, and I realize that they don't get discussed very much in English because either A, Japanese people don't realize that people outside of Japan don't understand these concepts, and B, if you don't speak Japanese, it's very easy to miss this. So I do think that I'm going to share some knowledge that you might not be able to find anywhere else. And on that note, I do just want to mention how appreciative I am that you're here with me tonight. I've learned that this is something I really enjoy doing and I want to continue doing more of it. And so if that interests you or you'd like to support me, please do click the like and subscribe buttons because you'd be surprised at how much that makes a difference in YouTube deciding who to show this video to. Thanks in advance and let's get into it. Okay, first, let's take a look at groups and collective societies. Japan is often called a collective society, and I'd imagine you have a good idea of what that means. But I want to get us to a place where we can understand that word. And I mean truly understand it beyond just a purely academic level. And the reason this is relevant here is because in comparative studies, while bullying in the West often involves a single, delinquent type of aggressor, Japanese bullying often involves entire peer groups turning against a single individual. So with that in mind, I think social dynamics is an absolutely core issue to this discussion here, and it's pretty dark, but it is a very interesting topic. So before we really dive into how group bullying works, let me try to explain how groups work in Japan. And I think the best way to start this is to actually talk about anime, because if you've watched enough anime, you've probably noticed something. It's not exactly hidden. The moral of the story is almost always friendship. Naruto, friendship. One Piece, friendship. My Hero Academia, friendship. And Fairy Tail is so aggressive about the concept that they literally named the guild after it. The power of friendship is such a reliable trope that it's become a meme. The hero is losing a fight badly and then they remember their friends and suddenly they find the strength to win. And for the longest time, I just thought that this was a cheesy trope, which it is, kind of. But then I realized every culture does this, or at least some version of it. For a really clear example, let's leave Japan for a second and talk about Christian movies. Now, stay with me here because if you've ever watched a Christian movie, such as A Law for Christmas or A Dog for Christmas or even the Kino masterpiece, Boo! A Madea Halloween, you've probably noticed that no matter what problem the protagonist faces, the answer is to always trust in God. Is your marriage falling apart? Trust in God. Cancer diagnosis? Trust in God. Financial ruin? I think you see where this is going. And the parallels are pretty clear. What I'm trying to highlight here is how popular media holds a mirror up to our values as a culture. When you see the same answer appearing over and over again across different stories, you're looking at something that a culture considers the ultimate truth, a foundational good. And so in Christian media, that's faith, but in Japanese media, that's the group. And the thing is that can come out in weird ways. So you may be familiar, for example, with the saying, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." But in Japan, there's a different set of values. Prioritizing conformity, the Japanese saying goes, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered down." Rather than seeking solutions through individual attention, in Japan, the reward for individuality is forced conformity. And that forced conformity is because the Japanese social structure is built around equitable groups in a way that can be difficult to fully appreciate it if you're unfamiliar with the culture. I'm not saying that Japanese people value community more than Americans or Europeans do. The reality is a bit more nuanced. It's more like the architecture of how the groups fit together is just completely different. So here's what that looks like. In Japan, friends group you form in childhood often stick with you well into your adult life, if not, well, forever. And not because you all just happen to stay close, but because maintaining that group is considered in and of itself a virtue. And leaving that group, even if you've grown apart, even if you don't particularly like everyone in it anymore, is something like a minor betrayal. It suggests that something is wrong with you. Your social life is often made up of many of these such groups: middle school friends, college tennis teammates, people you worked part-time job with, and the list goes on and on. And this can produce situations that might seem strange on the surface to outsiders. Things like maintaining friendships with people you don't actually enjoy spending time with, or attending gatherings that you'd rather skip because your absence would be noticed, interpreted, and discussed. The group isn't just a collection of individuals who happen to get along. The group is an entity, and your membership in it carries obligations. But the flip side is that you're a member of that group too. So, even if you make a mistake, if you get on someone's nerves, you're still a part of that group. Individual preferences take a backseat to stability, and that's where some of the security comes from. An interesting example that some of you may already know about is that when the Yakuza are punished, they often have to remove their pinky finger. This is because that pinky finger is a counterbalance to their sword grip, and having that much less control over your sword meant that you are more likely to stand by your brothers instead of going off alone. And if that example didn't make it clear, this group mentality extends beyond the worlds of school. Your school is a group, sure, but so is your company. Your neighborhood is a group. And the boundaries between the inside of the group, or uchi, and the outside of the group, or soto, as it's called in Japanese, are sharply defined. Being on the outside of the group is generally not where you want to find yourself. There's a well-documented issue that moving into the countryside can be difficult because the community takes a long time to accept outsiders. But in reality, you'll see this even on a minor scale in daily life. For example, here's a real story I read about. A young woman started visiting a new bathhouse. She was treated as an outsider and was largely ignored, despite being a local. But then one day, that bathhouse was temporarily closed, and all of the regulars had to go to the next bathhouse down the way. Now, when the young woman arrives at this new bathhouse, you might think that the other women continued to ignore her, but in reality, they joyfully yelled out to her so that she could find them. These people who had previously refused to give her the time of day were lighting up at the sight of her. They'd say, "Hey you, we're all over here, come over." Suddenly, she found herself on the inside due to this set of circumstances. She may have been an outsider at first, yes, but she was their outsider, and it was their duty to accept her once they had to face what I guess you could call adversity. Like I said, right, this is nuanced and interesting stuff. And all of Japanese society, the rules for what form of Japanese you speak, how you behave, what your mutual expectations are, all of these things change depending on which side of that boundary you're on. So to be without an uchi, an inner circle, is to be without a home. Okay, one last tangent, but I promise this is a good one. There's this absolutely outstanding TV series, Beef. And it's not Japanese, it's an amazing show that highlights the identity struggle of being Asian American, but there's a minor scene that I think about all the time. In the middle of the show, the child actor from Nope drops this bombshell.
Western therapy doesn't work on Eastern minds.
Western therapy doesn't work on Eastern minds. And it's played off like a throwaway line or joke, but hear me out. From my limited understanding, the point of therapy is to reconcile the friction between reality and our own emotions or internal expectations, etc. So, if you have narcissistic parents, a therapist might suggest for you to go no contact with them as an extreme measure. But from a collective culture perspective, how exactly are you supposed to do that? How are you supposed to cut off your parents if that endangers the relationship with the rest of your family? And then maybe your neighbors judge you for it, and those neighbors are the families of your friends since elementary school. This will undoubtedly cause more problems. And what's more, what are you going to do with that giant identity vacuum you just introduced by changing your life as you knew it? While saying therapy doesn't work on Eastern minds might be a bit strong of a statement, I think there is something to that idea that they're collectivist problems that are very difficult to solve with individualist solutions. And I think that's going to play into some of the stuff we talk about tonight. Alright, enough legwork. Bullying in Japan, let's talk about it. Now, what we translate as bullying in English is actually known as ijime in Japanese. And cards on the table here, there's a lot of context that gets lost in translation. Ijime is a broader, and I'd argue darker, phenomenon. When I started researching this section, I was fully prepared to find out that bullying is basically the same everywhere, that kids are cruel in universal ways, and the differences are mostly on the surface level. But imagine my surprise to find out that I was wrong. There's actually comparative studies on these differences. For example, the one I'll be referencing tonight, Comparisons Between English Bullying and Japanese Ijime by Tomoyuki Kanetsuna and Peter K. Smith. So to make sure I give you the full picture, I will reference this study and add in some real-life examples so that you can see these points in action. And just quick safety check, I'm going to keep these details on the cases here light to make sure this video stays accessible to everyone, but I will link the full stories in the description, and I genuinely encourage you to read them if you're in the right mindset. These people's stories deserve to be heard better than I can tell it here on YouTube. Earlier, I said that ijime is a darker phenomenon than bullying, and there's three major points I'm going to touch on here as to why that is. So first, as I hinted before, ijime is predominantly a group phenomenon. In Western contexts, bullying is often framed as an individual aggressor acting out. Ijime, though, is typically entire peer groups turning against a single individual. This is actually the precise definition in Japanese academia. Researchers consistently list group participation as a defining characteristic of ijime. So instead of a scary kid that you avoid in the hallways, it's your own in-group refusing to assimilate you, to the point of hostility. And in fact, it's not just the researchers who use this definition. 90% of Japanese students only consider it ijime if it's a group acting against an individual. If it's one-on-one, that's just people not getting along. So by definition, we're talking something that has to be group-based, and when bullying becomes group-based, the bullying itself becomes devastating. Consider the 1986 of Hirofumi Shikagawa, an 8th grader in Tokyo, tormented by classmates for months. 3 months before his passing, his classmates staged a mock funeral. They set up decorations on his desk, placed his photograph at the center with flowers, and passed around a condolence card which most of his classmates signed. In fact, so did his homeroom teacher who wrote, "May his soul sleep in peace." Shikagawa was still alive. He left a note, "My life is the same as living in hell." And if that wasn't enough to make your blood boil, then there's always the fact that a Tokyo court later ruled it was not bullying, but a single episode. Oh, well, that's good then. And that reaction, the reaction of the teacher and the court, brings me to my second point. Ijime is systematically tolerated by the very people that should be stopping it. Teachers, adults, school administrators, these are people who are supposed to be your emergency line for safety. But bullying in Japan largely goes unreported, as only about 20% of bullying incidents are estimated to ever reach an adult. And why? Because of the lukewarm reaction. Now it's time to look at one of those Japanese concepts that doesn't come up in English. This one is called koto nakare shugi, which I'll just shorten to koto for this section. Koto literally means must not make a sceneism, and that's not me making a joke, that is the most literal way I can translate it. More naturally though, you might say it's the ideology that you don't rock the boat. And let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. Let's say a teacher is forced to deal with a bullying situation. Culturally, teachers are expected to prioritize class harmony over individual justice. This all goes back to the importance of groups. If bullying or other serious incidents happened within a class, well, the actions of the few would become the sins of the group. So when applying for their next school or trying to compete in extracurricular activities, a poor reputation might impact the students negatively. So, with the intent of honoring the greater good, the teacher asks the impossible to the bullying victim. Please get along with their bullies, because after all, being bullied affects more than just themselves. And by this point, I doubt you'd be surprised to hear that the bullies don't even get the same conversation. The responsibility falls on the victim, and that's if the teacher even addresses it in the first place. Whether it's out of personal preference or warnings from the administration, more often than not, teachers end up looking the other way. Schools themselves have historically been incentivized to underreport. Acknowledging ijime reflects poorly on the institution, on the homeroom teacher's control, on students' performance metrics. It's the same story as before, just at the institutional level. Now, whether this is by incident or by design, we can see this conflict aversion in actual data. In one study, 70% of high school teachers stated that there was no bullying in cases where bullying was later confirmed. Kanetsuna and Smith's research found a profound lack of trust in teachers among Japanese students, and it's not exactly hard to imagine why, because they're just not a solution. To see how deep this can go, let's take a look at the 2011 Otsu City case, name redacted. A 13-year-old boy had been tormented by classmates for months. He was physically attacked, verbally abused, and, according to student testimony, repeatedly told to practice for his death. Over 60 students witnessed what was happening. Teachers were aware. One homeroom teacher reportedly saw incidents of the boy being forced to eat dead bees. He laughed it off as roughhousing and an amazing display of cognitive dissonance. Then the boy died, for real. And what happened next was arguably worse. The school denied bullying was ever involved. The city's Board of Education backed them up. And when authorities tried to get to the truth of the matter by handing out anonymous questionnaires to the students, the surveys were conveniently lost. What we now know was dozens of accounts describing the abuse. They all just went missing. The school tried to bury it. It was only after an individual hero leaked the actual data to the press that the public saw the truth, and they were understandably outraged. Finally, the public was able to demand accountability for the incident. The resulting scandal directly led to the 2013 Ijime Prevention Methods Promotion Law, which, for the first time, legally required schools to investigate and report bullying. We will check in back with that later to see how that goes, but don't get your hopes up. And before we move on to number 3, think about that timeline for a second. Over 60 children and multiple adults knew the truth. Nobody spoke out to the police or even spoke in public. And keep in mind, this was 2011, they had Twitter. That's how strong this group mentality is. The school felt its duty to the students was to hide their sins. It still had to be extracted through anonymous surveys leaked by a whistleblower and pressured by national media coverage before anyone even took responsibility. So, this leaves us with the third point, and this is what makes ijime particularly devastating in a Japanese context. It doesn't just hurt in the moment, it can derail your entire social development. Remember what we established earlier. In Japan, learning to function within a group is a fundamental part of being Japanese. The entire society runs on it. Your classroom, your workplace, your neighborhood association. School is where you're supposed to learn those skills. It's the training ground where you figure out how to read social cues, navigate conflict, and cooperate on tasks. Thousands and thousands of hours of practice. But because ijime is when your own group turns against you, people who get bullied miss out on that practice. Japanese researchers tracked out bullying affected what they call non-cognitive skills. Things like persistence, self-control, cooperation, the stuff that actually determines whether you can hold down a job and maintain relationships. What they found was expectedly not great. Every year, non-victims were gaining these skills as expected, but the bullying victims were flatlining or even declining. This left permanent scars as their growth was stunted, and the scars don't fade when graduation comes. A 2020 study looked over 2,000 Japanese adults and asked them about their childhoods. And you want to know something? Childhood bullying was the single strongest predictor of mental distress in adulthood. Not poverty, not abusive parents, ijime. Decades later, victims are still carrying that weight. Think of it this way. Your body has a stress response system, like a thermostat. When something stressful happens, a hormone called cortisol spikes, you deal with it, and the system resets, or that's what should happen. But if that stressful situation is really your daily safe space, you can't escape. You're locked in a room with the people tormenting you for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, month after month. Your stress thermostat gets cranked up to the highest setting for years, and eventually it just breaks. Your body stops producing normal amounts of stress hormones because it's trying to protect itself from the constant flood. The problem is, now your stress response doesn't work properly anymore. When ijime victims grow up and try to enter the workforce, the broken thermostat can't handle it. They either overreact with panic or they shut down entirely. In a society where you cannot function outside of groups, having your body's ability to handle group settings permanently damaged is a sort of silent disability. An adult who was bullied in school is 40% more likely to suffer from serious mental distress than someone who wasn't. And with these three things in mind, this is why ijime can be such a horrible, life-changing phenomenon. The characteristics of ijime are rooted in the exact same mechanisms that enforce social cohesion in Japanese society in the first place. Remember what I said earlier about how Japanese media treats friendship in the group the same way that Christian media treats God? The ultimate good, right? The foundational answer. If that's true and the group is some sort of divine good, then ijime is like meeting the devil. No wonder Shikagawa said, "My life is the same as living in hell." Okay, so we've established that bullying exists, why it's so harmful, and how the system passively enables it. And I think a fair question here now is, why? Why does any of this happen in the first place? Well, the thing about bullying is that it technically serves a social function. Sociologists, evolutionary psychologists, and even Karl Marx agreed that bullying forms in social systems to reinforce certain behaviors in its members. And just to be clear, please don't interpret that as me subtly endorsing bullying. I'll let you know right now that it's toxic, ineffective, and immoral. But this idea that bullying is used to reinforce a set of values makes a lot of sense in this case. On one hand, I think it's fair to say that Japanese society strongly values equality. But on the other hand, I think it's funny how a word can mean different things to different people. Here, equality isn't so much everyone has a chance as it is nobody should be different. Different is dangerous. Think of a social group as a school of fish. The whole point is synchronized movement. If one fish moves too slow, it drags the group down. If one fish moves too fast, it can mess up the formation. And if fish start breaking off from the group entirely, it threatens the safety of all of the fish. So, what happens when a fish starts deviating from the norm? Well, the group corrects it. It's not so much a conscious decision by any one fish. It's more the result of pressure from all sides that forces the group into conformity. So on this line of thought, let's look at bullying in three major groups. Bullying for conformity against those who are different, bullying against those that are ahead of the group to bring them down, and bullying against those that threaten the group entirely to bully them out. Let me give you some examples of each, starting with the first type of bullying, bullying for conformity. And in this case, bullying is used as a tool to force conformity within the group. In Japanese surveys, the number one cited reason for bullies to choose their victims isn't physical weakness or unpopularity. It's not being able to read the air or sticking out too much, the child who likes different music, the returnee student who spent years abroad, and now speaks too much English or acts too Western. It can even be things like the kid that doesn't read the same manga. Now, these people aren't threats in any meaningful sense, they're just different. This bullying isn't about punishing bad behavior, it's about forced conformity. Join the formation or be pushed out of it. What's unusual here is you'd think that the primary audience for the bullying is the victim themselves, right? And the bullying is the way to get the kid to conform, but that's actually only half of the story. The other half is that it sends a message to everyone else, telling them, this is what happens when you're different. Here's a lighter example of this effect in action. There's an ultra-popular manga, Demon Slayer. It's pretty violent, earning an R rating in the US and a 15 in the UK, but it was really popular in elementary schools in Japan. And this caused a problem for parents, but not quite in the way you'd expect. The parents knew they could choose to just not buy their children the manga, but they also knew that all of the other kids were reading the manga, and they didn't want their children to be the odd one out. So they looked at the graphic content of the manga, decapitations, eviscerations, narcoleptic perverts, and beautiful topless pigmen, and they said, yeah, I'd rather my child be exposed to all of that than risking kimehara, or demon slayer harassment. And yes, this was a real thing. They bought their kids the violent manga just so they could fit in and maybe not get bullied. Conformity. That's the first bullying type. Now, the second type is bullying to drag somebody down. It's slightly counterintuitive. This type of bullying targets those who fly too high or swim too fast. A 2017 study from Japan's National Institute for Educational Policy Research found that children with high academic literacy are actually more likely to be victims of bullying, which sounds familiar, right? Even in the West, the trope is that nerdy, smart kids with no social skills are the target of bullying. It's actually so well ingrained that I personally never stopped to question it. But think about what that means. If someone is excelling a bit too much, it makes your life harder too. Higher expectations, looking worse in comparison, always feeling like second best. In a completely selfish and twisted way, it's easier for you to slow them down than to try to catch up. And that's exactly what happens. Smart or talented kids being bullied out of pure jealousy or selfishness. It's a simple explanation for why success isn't always celebrated, and that's the second bullying type. The third type of bullying is bullying somebody out of the group. This is a last resort of removing members who are seen as burdens to the group. In the fish metaphor, this is the fish that just keeps swimming in different directions, causing the group to have to continuously adjust itself in order to stay together. They're not too fast or too slow, they're just too different. Now, this may sound like the first type of bullying, but there's a key difference here. In the first type, the point of the bullying was to induce conformity and to make an example of the target. But this type of bullying is what happens when conformity is not possible. The group is past trying to adjust the behavior of the victim, they just want them gone. So in schools, this targets disabled students, kids with mental health issues, or anyone who needs more resources than the group feels is necessary. The bullying is an attempt to make them leave, to transfer schools, or to disappear, and you would be surprised by how much this happens. In 2024, 360,000 students across Japan missed school because they simply couldn't bear going anymore. And most of the time this is due to bullying. This is known as futoko, or school refusal. This number has risen for 12 straight years. And keep in mind, high school isn't compulsory in Japan. This number is only elementary and middle school students. So that 360,000 figure represents 1 in 25 students, almost 1 per class. Now, depending on your faith in humanity, you might ask, why doesn't anybody stop it? Let's take a look. A student comes into class one morning to find awful, nasty things written on their desk. They break down in tears. Almost the entire class watches on. Some are laughing, some are filming, but nobody helps. And I think a reasonable first thought here might be that nobody is feeling comfortable enough to take action. But I think maybe that's not quite the right way to read the situation. It's not that everybody is failing to act, it's that these are the actions. Whether they participated in the defamatory graffiti, filmed it for the group chat, or even just stood there silently, that is an action. They're demonstrating their membership to the group by showing they know how to read the room. The Japanese phrase is kuki o yomu, literally, to read the air. and it's one of those rare phrases that translates perfectly in English. Reading the air means to understand what the group wants and deliver it without being asked. This was such a big deal that Japanese repeatedly developed slang to refer to people who can't read the room. Now, 20 years ago, this was KY, an abbreviation of kuki omenai to mean someone who can't read the air. That got a little dated, so kuki buchi kawashi came into use in the early 2010s to describe ruining the mood. And a more recent, although somewhat niche term is ijime, short for chimeteki. This one means lethal and essentially is used to describe something or someone who straight up assassinates the vibes. So back to our example, the group has decided that somebody is out. If you help them, you're saying that the group is wrong, or even worse, that you aren't actually part of the group. And these are just things that you never want to say in a collective environment, regardless of whether it's bullying or even something more innocent, like everyone in the class liking the same manga. So they stand there, they laugh, and they perform. And this is kind of why going to a parent or teacher makes it worse, assuming they do anything at all. If the problem is your relationship to the wider group, how exactly is an outsider going to help? A parent may have a certain amount of authority as an adult, but at the end of the day, they just aren't part of that group, so they don't have the social capital to really make a difference. And teachers may be a bit closer to the group, but as I mentioned before, they are generally incentivized not to address the bullying at all. Similar to the students, their inaction itself is a deliberate action. They just belong to a different group. If they surface a bullying problem that becomes a headache for the other faculty, suddenly they've put themselves outside of their own group. A bullying scandal would mean angry parents, news cameras, police investigations, and so on. So naturally, they would start to get pushed out of their own social group as a result. So to put it simply, whether it's students, teachers, principals, or even higher, everyone is part of a group that both protects them but diminishes their ability to take individual actions to save the outliers. And make a note of this, because once we start talking about bullying in workplaces and online, this is still going to be true. But the frustrating thing about all of this inaction is that there's a law that's supposed to fix this. The 2013 ijime prevention law is what I mentioned before. It requires schools to investigate and report bullying. And so this was supposed to protect individuals who decided that they wanted to escalate the behavior to authority, because now you're not going against the group, you're just following the law. That sounds good, right? But there's one massive oversight here. The law did not introduce criminal penalties for covering bullying up, so there's no funding consequences, no accreditation risks, not even a disapproving glance. The law gave schools an obligation to take action while leaving them in charge of deciding what counts as action. And you can imagine how that went. In fact, one study even suggested that this law made things worse. Now that bullying was a legal matter, it was more beneficial than ever to just refuse to acknowledge bullying. Since addressing the problem could no longer be solved in-house and it had to be reported to the police, it was now easier just to say something wasn't bullying in the first place. And the frustrating thing about that is that it also extends to the courts. In legal battles, the argument often revolves around the semantics of what qualifies as bullying, if you can even get that far. In 2017, a high school student was being bullied at a private school in Nagasaki. After his death, a third-party committee investigated and concluded that bullying was the cause. The school decided that they would rather experience a different reality, so they spread their own version of events to parents and students. And when the family sued, the school took the honorable route. And by that I mean they caused an unending stream of legal hurdles and delays. Their strategy was to file motions, request extensions, and overall make the process so exhausting that the family gives up. 8 years later, the family is still in court, and it's no wonder that most families don't even make it that far. Even when families do win, compensation is low. The message is clear: fighting the system costs more than it pays. So let's think dystopian for a second. What would be the most bizarre canary in the coal mine situation that lets you know that a problem is really getting out of hand? If you guessed insurance, you're completely right. Tokyo Marine, the insurance company, saw this, and now they sell bullying insurance for just 120 yen a month. It covers up to 200,000 yen for counseling and school transfer costs. And so think about what that means. The market has decided that the system won't protect your kid, so you should buy a policy. At the very least, though, I guess it is an option for families with no other options remaining. We've seen how the students don't intervene, the bullies don't have to take accountability, the schools don't do their job, and the legal system still feels like it falls short. Every layer of the system is optimized for the same thing, making the problem invisible. So, with no mechanism in place to truly handle the bullying, at least the family has insurance? That's the most charitable take I can make here. But what happens when the kids grow up and they leave the school system? Once we get to the real world, nothing really changes. The bullies just trade in their school uniforms for three-piece suits. It's a new paint job on the same root cause. Earlier in the video, we talked about the 3 types of bullying. Bullying for conformity, bullying to bring someone down, and bullying somebody out of the group. All 3 patterns emerge in the workplace as well, and they're so common that Japanese has dozens of words for individual subgenres of bullying, usually framed as a type of harassment. And here's what that looks like. Under harassment for conformity, we have things like aruhara, or alcohol harassment. And despite the name, it's not about somebody on a drunken rampage, it's about forcing others to drink. So in Japanese work culture, the nomikai, or drinking party, is supposed to encourage bonding. But when superiors start pressuring subordinates to finish drinks in a single gulp, or to keep pouring after somebody's already sick, it stops being bonding and becomes something else entirely: harassment or bullying. In 2013, a court found a supervisor liable for forcing an employee to keep drinking even after the employee vomited. The employee had repeatedly said that he couldn't tolerate alcohol, but that didn't matter to the supervisor. The court awarded 1.5 million yen in damages, and there's even been deaths from alcohol poisoning in these settings for no other reason other than what can be called peer or supervisor pressure to drink when everybody else is drinking. Then there's punishment disguised as discipline. One type is overtime harassment. Take the 2024 case where a former ground self-defense force member was forced to stay late at work and write a 10,000-character reflection paper. What was his crime? He'd gained weight and his superiors didn't like it. The court awarded him 1.5 million yen in damages. And as a side note, one more notable thing about that case is that his superiors assigned him a room on the 5th floor of the dormitory so that he had to take the stairs up and down to force him to lose weight. And the kicker of it all is that he was gaining weight because he had a leg injury and couldn't walk. And this is what conformity harassment is. It's often petty, perpetuated by management or peer pressure, and it's aimed at things that others simply don't like about you. Moving on from conformity, let's talk about harassment used to bring someone down. This one is a very common type of harassment, mostly coming in the form of pawahara, or power harassment. Someone in a position of authority uses that power to make you do something that's outside of your job description, or maybe scrutinize your work more than necessary, or simply just cap your visibility so that other people can't see you succeed. And a 2016 government survey found that 32.5% of workers had experienced power harassment in the preceding years, 1 in 3. And this is one of the ones that you see come into the courts a lot. In 2009, a trainee sued after a senior turned him into the site's punching bag. The senior spat gum on him, threw a needle-tipped surveying tool that injured his foot, and kept the insults coming in front of others. He was forced to do overnight overtime alone, sometimes without breaks. The court found that the employer was responsible for 1.5 million yen. A performer at Tokyo Disneyland sued after management subjected her to pawahara that caused a physical breakdown. A child had injured the worker's finger, and when she sought workers' compensation, her boss called her mentally weak. The Chiba District Court ruled in her favor, 880,000 yen. The management company, Oriental Land Corporation, apologized to visitors for the inconvenience. They did not apologize to her. The goal of this kind of harassment is simple. It's hammering down the nail that sticks up, regardless of how much force is needed. And of course, the third type of harassment to push somebody out of the group, happens in the workforce as well. One of the biggest examples I talked about in my population video is matahara, or maternity harassment. If you get pregnant, you might find that suddenly your projects just disappear. Your promotion could get delayed. You're not fired, but you're gradually pushed out and your career is left to wither. A 2016 Ministry of Health survey found that 22% of full-time employees and 49% of temporary staff had experienced maternity harassment in some shape or form. In 2014, a physical therapist in Hiroshima sued after being demoted, all for the sin of requesting lighter work during her pregnancy. The district court threw her case out, and so did the high court. She had to take it all the way to the Supreme Court before eventually winning, and now demoting a woman without consent, whatever that means, for being pregnant is, in principle, illegal. She was awarded 1.75 million yen. It took 7 years to reach that judgment. There's also patahara, which is just the paternity harassment equivalent. It's the same thing, but for men who try to take parental leave. Glenn Wood, a Canadian who worked at Mitsubishi UFJ Morgan Stanley for over 3 decades, requested paternity leave in 2015 when his son was born prematurely. The companies refused. He rushed to the hospital anyway because, as you're about to learn, Glenn Wood was not afraid of the group. When he returned, he was stripped of his responsibilities, excluded from meetings, and eventually fired. And I want to reiterate this, he was fired for attending to his son who was born prematurely, so he sued. In 2020, the Tokyo District Court ruled against him. In 2022, the High Court also rejected his appeal, calling the company's actions inevitable. Wood says he'll take it to the Supreme Court even if the legal battle lasts until his son is in college. Now that's what I call inevitable. But firing someone in Japan is actually very difficult. If a company really wants you gone but they can't legally fire you, there's always the oidashibeya, given the unfortunate English translation of the forcing out room. In reality, it's an empty room with nothing to do. There's no assignments, no colleagues, just you and a desk, day after day. Companies like Sony, Panasonic, and Hitachi have all faced reports of doing this practice. While doing nothing may sound like a dream job, the isolation and calculated exclusion make it a uniquely hostile environment. The message is clear: you don't belong here anymore. So with all these legal cases flying around, what does Japan do about all this? In 2019, the government passed the Power Harassment Prevention Act. It requires companies to establish consultation systems and to take preventative measures. Sounds good, but stop me if you've heard this one before. There are no criminal penalties. There's a lack of clear grounds for victims to be able to claim damages. If a company violates the law, the penalties max out at guidance, recommendations, and maybe public shaming if the violation is egregious enough. The law requires companies to try to prevent power harassment. The key word here being try. As long as there's a hotline and a policy document somewhere, the company is in the clear. And how is that working out? Well, according to one survey, 47% of workers who reported harassment through these systems said their company did nothing. So, most harassment never gets reported. Sounds familiar, right? The cases I've shared so far here are exceptions. These are the cases where someone decided that the cost of silence was worse than the cost of fighting. If a worker decides that they want to pursue a case beyond the hotline, then they can sue under general tort law, but that's civil law, not criminal. The burden of proof is on you. The process takes years. One workplace harassment case awarded 23 million yen, but only after lengthy litigation, and arguably, that's on the higher end. You may have noticed that in a lot of the cases I listed before, the victim got about 1.5 million yen in damages. That might sound like the hammer of justice ringing out, but that's $9,500. Most people don't have that kind of time or money to litigate for under 10,000 USD, so most people just endure. That's what happened to the mayor's office in Yokohama. And that brings us back full circle. In January 2026, the HR director for the mayor of Yokohama held a press conference. Jun Kubota stood in front of cameras and described what it was like to work for the mayor, Yamanaka, who had been verbally abusive, mentally abusive, and physically intimidating. Kubota told stories about how he'd have to take responsibility with his life for failure. But think about who Kubota is for a second. This is the HR director. This is supposed to be the guy, the man who handles complaints about this exact behavior. But his options were so limited that he had to leak information to a magazine and later hold a public press conference just to get something to happen. The internal channels were so completely broken that the HR director couldn't get help going through the system. And if the HR director can't do it, then the system has to be completely rebuilt. Fortunately, the city council heard his message and voted unanimously for a third-party investigation. And that investigation led to the dance of denial I talked about at the top of this video. Yamanaka initially denied everything, then partially admitted to some of it, and right now he's in the middle of the gray zone. He is still currently in office at the time of this recording, but the sword of Damocles could fall at any moment. And his tactics map perfectly onto the 3 pillars we've been discussing. When staff hesitate to fail or show allegiance, he punishes them in front of everybody else, so the group learns what compliance looks like. He brings down anyone talented enough to push back because he sees them as a threat. As a result, he crushes everybody else before they can make him look bad. And then he calls them low spec or human trash to push them out. By being so toxic and pushing out anybody with self-respect or the ability to leave, you cultivate a group that buys into the cult of personality or just doesn't have any options. The system pushes out anybody who won't submit. So to sum it all up, Yamanaka isn't some outlier in a system. He's more like the final form of that system. The product of a system that taught children to tolerate cruelty, that taught teachers to look away, and taught schools to bury evidence. This system also raised a man who became mayor and governed through humiliation. Somewhere along the way, he learned that this behavior wasn't just tolerated, it was actively helping him. Well, I say somewhere, but we've spent this entire video explaining exactly where. Whether a child is bullied or a worker is harassed, the result used to be the same. The story stayed in the room. And for decades, that's how it worked. Bullying would enter the public consciousness every decade or so due to a case that gained media attention, but it inevitably faded away. The internet might have ended this cycle. The internet cuts through all of the internal controls that these institutions have in place. By the time anyone thinks about suppression, millions of people have already seen it. And make no mistake, that's exactly what happened with this recent wave of videos. They did try to suppress it. The Japanese government held an emergency meeting on January 16th, where they requested that social media platforms quickly delete the videos as soon as they're uploaded. It would appear that the authorities are capable of quick, decisive action when it comes to bullying victims, making them look bad. So over the span of roughly a month, 3 extreme cases of bullying hit the internet and combined into a single news story. But this time, we weren't hearing secondhand accounts after the school had spent years trying to cover the stories up. We were seeing it unfold in front of our very eyes in real time. And on the internet, the audience is not incentivized to cover it up like everybody else. They're not a part of the group. And on Twitter, there's no room to read. There's just outrage, which further pushes it through the algorithm. And this is progress of a kind. While social media isn't really an ideal solution, it completely strips away all of the defensive that have traditionally suppressed bullying incidents. Institutions that relied on controlling the narrative are losing control. And it would be nice if I could leave it here, but we both know that the internet as a solution for bullying would be a ridiculous take. As you can probably imagine, the internet is not some miracle space that exposes bullying and is all sunshine and dandelions. It also functions as the arena for a new, digital type of cruelty. And in this new type of bullying, a crowd of people that thinks they're justified gets a bit overboard with the brand of what they feel like is justice. Take the sushi kid, for example. If you're not familiar with this story, there's a conveyor belt sushi place called Sushiro, and a teenager at one of these restaurants licked a soy sauce bottle, touched sushi on a conveyor belt with his saliva-slicked finger, and he filmed it. The video went viral, getting 40 million views. And of course, what he did was genuinely disgusting. I sincerely cannot understand what would drive someone to do something like that in the first place. But even I think what happened next went too far. So the internet, as they do, found him, doxed him, identified his school, and flooded the school with complaints. His name and face were spread everywhere online, and Sushiro sued him for 67 million yen, $500,000. Now, part of the reason for the number being so high is that the company's stock dropped 5% following the incident, wiping out around 16 billion yen in market value. And at the center of all of this was just a single 17-year-old boy. The case eventually settled for an undisclosed amount, but more than the money, he permanently bears the mark of what the Japanese call a digital tattoo. Google his name and the sushi incident comes up. forever. And keep in mind, Japan has strict privacy laws for juvenile criminals for this very reason. Now, regardless of your personal belief, Japan decided as a society that the crimes of a minor should not be permanently tied to their name. But it did, and the response to his action destroyed his life. And that's the problem here. The internet doesn't understand proportionality. The behavior that should be bringing people into line often goes way too far. But that case is simple, right? You play stupid games and win stupid prizes. I agree it's not the most sympathetic case. But what about situations where it's not immediately clear who the real villain is? Well, what happens is that the righteous fury of the internet becomes indistinguishable from simple bullying. Just take the case of Hana Kimura, which is infamous even outside of the Japanese sphere. Hana was a professional wrestler and a cast member on Terrace House, which, if you haven't heard of it, is a Netflix reality show where beautiful strangers live together and pretend to be awkward, all while a group of unrelated people react to them, I guess. But this manic pixie life took what should have been the gentlest of detours one day after a cast member ruined Hana's wrestling costume. Now, something to keep in mind is that the producers had set this up and asked Hana to escalate the conflict and slap her roommate's face. Now, Hana didn't agree with violence outside of the ring, so she settled on slapping the hat off of her housemate. The producers agreed, so they put it to print. The internet saw this scene and they decided that they just wouldn't tolerate it. Hundreds of messages flooded her inbox every day. They told her that everyone would be happy if she was gone. They called her a gorilla, mocked her dark skin, and told her that she didn't deserve to exist. And eventually, they got their wish. One of the guys who sent her messages got a summary order under Japan's insult law. 9,000 yen, about $70. Now, to put that in perspective, if you had 9,000 yen and asked your friend to loan you $10, you could buy Mario Kart, which just simply wasn't severe enough, and her mother agreed, and that is a silver lining about this case because Hana's mother successfully campaigned for stronger laws following the incident. Online insults now carry up to a year in prison or a 300,000 yen fine, and police have more tools to track down anonymous posters. And in what can only be described as a minor miracle, law enforcement is actually using these tools. They reported over 200 arrests in the first year since the new laws were written. But back to my point here, what I'm trying to say is that the internet is putting an already toxic system into overdrive. While, yes, the internet does make it harder for schools to cover up bullying, they don't erase the problem. In fact, they make it materially worse, and the statistics show it. Cases of cyberbullying have roughly tripled over the past decade, from around 8,000 to over 23,000, according to the Ministry of Education data. That should bother you. While in-person bullying was cruel and unnecessary, there was at least a pretense of a purpose. At least the people who were perpetrating the bullying had to show their face and put their own standing in the group on the line. But what group did Hana Kimura's harassers belong to? What personal stake did they have in the situation? Nothing. They just felt like being nasty to someone, then logged off and gave themselves a pat on the back. And as for the sushi kid, sure, touching other people's food is gross, but is destroying someone's life an appropriate response? I'm not trying to justify anybody's behavior here. I just can't get enthusiastic about a system where your penalty is decided by how big your story hits the algorithm. Alright, I understand that got bleak by the end. And I also understand that with the kind of content I make, it would be natural to assume that I'm just cataloging flaws in Japanese society, but I do want to say that that's not quite my intention here. The Japanese culture of resolving things within the group and having the people you see every day hold you accountable is not the enemy here. More often than not, it's a gentle correction, and this is why you can have amazing things in Japan like honors system shops, sports fans that clean up after themselves, or the sort of safety that allows for young children to walk outside by themselves. The problem is only on the extreme ends of the spectrum, and I don't want to discuss the extremes to justify or critique an entire society. I hope we can all be judged on our consistent behavior rather than our best or worst days. No, what I'm trying to do here is take something that seems so extreme that there's no room for thought or analysis or discussion and break it down. I want to make it easier for people to reflect on and discuss, especially when Japanese society can be unique, subtle, and impenetrable if you don't understand the language. Hundreds of years of Japanese culture clashing with the modern global landscape. That's not something we can easily fix. And clearly Japanese society does care to fix the issue. The government is taking action, laws, task forces, awareness campaigns, and so on. But these problems can be quite difficult to fix from the inside of the culture. Goodness knows that Japan prefers slow and steady change instead of something sudden and drastic, so it takes time. So ultimately, I think I'd just like to say this. Think whatever you want about whoever is the villain of the week, that's your business. But before you add your voice to the pile, think about the power you have when your voice is amplified by the many. And if you're going to call someone out, ask them to fix the issue you have with them, not to leave the planet.